it used to be amazingly special and important to be able to read or write. And it also used to mean that very few things ever got written down. If you think about ancient Egypt, the earliest texts are called the pyramid texts. At that stage, the afterlife was only for the pharaoh and for his family, the royal people who were supposed to be related to the gods. And so people actually were killed to go into tombs with them. Later on, of course, they had little figures made of servants. Then the second set of texts are called the coffin texts, and by that stage the afterlife has become a little bit more democratized. Some nobles are doing it as well. By the time you get to the Book of the Dead, which, as you probably know, is called properly called the Book of Going Forth by Night, the idea is that really anybody can have an afterlife as long as they have their body preserved by mummification so that they can take part. This is showing how an idea that began with a tiny group of people who were a privileged elite spread out gradually, so other people wanted it. And we know that even poor people had themselves eviscerated and filled up with sand and their bodies painted with pitch so that they wouldn't decay, because the idea was that you had to have your body for the afterlife. Every religion has a book that they think it contains everything that you really need. The Sikhs have the Adi Granth. There are various Hindu scriptures, various Buddhist scriptures. What I would argue is that when those texts came into existence, only particularly significant things were ever written down, and they were believed to have great importance in guiding the life of the community. We know almost nothing actually about the beginnings of any of these ancient religions. We know little legends about people. Even what is known about the so-called historical Jesus is very little. Very, very, very little about the historical Buddha, about Confucius. You're in the realms of legend. And it's a little bit also like looking at the sorts of things we read now and thinking about history in the Middle Ages. It's mostly written about kings and nobles because they're the important people. Nowadays we have radical democratization. Almost everybody in the developed world and many, many people in the non-developed world can read. Anyone can write. One of the things that most people didn't realize when writing was really important was that you could write down lies. There's actually a quote, one of Marcus Aurelius's quotes, which says, "I will not believe it unless I've read it." Nowadays we say, "Oh, this is not worth the paper it's written on. I wouldn't believe that." If the newspapers spread it all, we know that people use writing to say things that are propaganda or literally false. Celebrity magazines constantly talking about people getting divorced or married or having babies, and it's all rubbish, absolute rubbish. A radical shift happened in the 18th century. Firstly, we had the Enlightenment. Philosophers came around, people like David Hume in Scotland and Kant in Germany, said things like, well, human reason is the way to know about things. You can't just talk about religious revelation or have somebody standing in church telling you how to do what you're going to do. You have to experience it for yourself. You have to reason it for yourself, and then you make a decision. And then one of the other things that happened in that century, in the 18th century, is that the novel became really important. And novels are one of the great revolutions in our culture. I think most people don't realize this. When you read a novel, you read about people who actually don't exist. They're imaginary, but you invest emotionally in them. You want to know, when you're reading War and Peace, how will the family survive the Napoleonic Wars? Will Pierre marry Natasha? Will they be happy? And this is significant because before novels became important, people used to read sermons and religious books only for entertainment. Novels taught people about marriage for love, about choice, about how to imagine themselves as more glamorous, more interesting, having a different life. That's why they became so massively popular and people began writing millions of them. And there are trillions of novels written in the 18th and 19th centuries, unutterably awful ones, if we read them now as students, that were so popular because people devoured these things. They just loved them, and they were produced also inexpensively. And so then we start the beginning of the 20th century, and the moving picture has been invented. It's a better kind of novel. You can sit in darkness in a theatre and have an entrancing story happen around you, and you can believe you're in that world. I talk to students now, and I think this has been lost a little bit. When I was young, films were really, really important. And it was because they took you into a different world. We teach a unit called Religion and Film. My colleague Christopher Hartney and I teach it. He teaches mostly. I do a few guests here and there. We often talk to students now and they say, oh, we watch films on our iPad or on our... And when you want to make a cup of coffee, you pause it, and then, you talk on the phone to your friend, and then you have a shower, and then you come back and you watch a bit more. And I think that's completely... It's almost destroyed what films can do for you. Some students, however, though, and it's not just my students, but this happens all over the world. Marcus Davidson, who works at Leiden University, has done work on people who have made religions out of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. The films that Peter Jackson made, when you go into the cinema and you see a Lord of the Rings trilogy marathon, and you're in the darkness with this giant... You believe you're in another world. And I think it's very hard for people to understand that heaven and angels and demons and hell, they're just imaginary worlds, like Middle Earth is an imaginary world, like the science fiction imaginary worlds of writers like Robert A. Heinlein and Isaac Asimov are imaginary worlds. And those worlds came out of the heads of people. It's just that with religious texts, it happened so long ago that no one could observe the process, and they have grown over time to have this kind of special status. Oh. I mean, there's amazing stuff in a lot of those religious texts. Almost every one of them has a battle, a war between gods, different families of gods. And this is a, battle, war. It's a reality for human beings, and it's always about dark side and the light side. So you have the devas, the gods in the Vedic texts from India, and they fight the asuras, who are the demons. And these stories, we all know these sorts of things. People still love them. Most adventure films are still about the baddies versus the goodies, When you say, can people live without God or supernatural beings or that kind of thing, that's a really tricky question to answer too, because there are two answers to it, and neither of them I think is completely right. The first is that some scholars just assume that everybody's always going to be religious, and so that if there isn't any God from the Bible that you will worship something else: money, possessions, success in your career, rock stars, actors, celebrities. And there are other people who say, actually, it doesn't really work like that. There were never these divine beings. They never really existed. People just made them up anyway. And so what happens is that an ongoing process of making up new stories that people will find meaningful and believable will just keep happening. It's just that the stories are different now. All right. I'm not sure that people need religion, but I think people need meanings and stories. There are several ways to come at it. You can come at it from a completely scientific point of view, and you can look at things like cognitive evolutionary biology and cognitive psychology, and people will say that people construct themselves through telling stories about themselves, and our stories about the people that we know are done relationally, and also that we revise our memory. Psychologists, neurologists who study memory point out that it's very plastic, and sometimes a memory that's recorded, say in a longitudinal study, someone will be revisited 5 years later and asked how they remember the particular incident that is being discussed, and the memory will be quite different because we reshape the way that we think about ourselves. And one way of thinking about that is that we are like characters in a story, but we're also the authors, in a way, of our own story. And so people want their stories to mean something. There's been what's sometimes called postmodern stories or films or things where, in fact, sometimes there aren't any narratives and you can't really tell what's going on. And people actually become extremely distressed with stories that they can't figure out where it begins, what is happening, and how it's going to end. So I think that desire to shape your life according to stories that are meaningful and that make sense to you is never going to go away. And I think a big difference now is, of course, that we have so many different stories to choose from, that if you think about, if you were a French woman in 1715, you couldn't be a Buddhist. Not only because you could never meet a Buddhist, but there wasn't even a single Buddhist text that had been translated into French at that time. You have no choice. It's not possible. You don't know about it. You can't learn about it. Nowadays, you can learn about any religion, and you can also combine bits of different religions. So sometimes one of the things that the West finds difficult is the idea that you can have multiple religious beliefs, because we always had the idea, if you're a Christian, there's one God and there's one story and it's the right story, and you can't share that with other gods. But one of the things that's happened as institutional Christianity's got weaker in the West is that people know more about other religions, and they keep the bits of Christianity that they like, which may include festivals or angels. Angels are very popular in the New Age, and other kinds of spiritual subcultures. And then they get rid of all the bits that they don't like and they replace them with other things. So people who aren't, committed Christians mostly are not very interested in hell. They're much more interested in reincarnation and maybe having more than one life and seeing how that might work. Okay, I don't think there is a Harry Potter religion yet, but I think I might show you something because you might find it amusing. This is a new book that I edited with a friend called Pavel Koznich, and it's not going to be readily available till next year because it's theoretically published in 2017. But there is a chapter in it on the Temple of the Jedi Order, and 3 members of the Temple of the Jedi Order wrote it for me. And I think the thing that is very important that you will find interesting is what they say. Ash Williams, Benjamin Alexander Miller, and Michael Kitchen are members of the Temple of the Jedi Order, which is not a community of Star Wars role players, but a church of a genuine religion, Jediism. The Jedi at this site are not the same as those portrayed within the Star Wars franchise. Star Wars Jedi are fictional characters. The Jedi of the Temple of the Jedi Order are real people within this world that live or lived their lives according to the principles of Jediism, the real Jedi religion. Now, that is interesting. There are actual temples of real-life people who practice Jediism. So I would say, yes, that's a religion. It's real, it's new, it's strange to a lot of people, but it actually exists. At the moment, with Harry Potter, there isn't a religion, but there are people who are interested in the Harry Potter stories as meaningful stories that could give people values and guide their lives and perhaps function in a spiritual way. If you've read the Harry Potter novels, they're very much about a conflict between good and evil. They're about moral development. They're about little kids who grow up in a terrifically dangerous world where there's a dark lord who's going to ruin everything, except that one of them has the power to stop him. But to do that, he has to make the right choices all the way along, and he has to face huge challenges, and people who protect him and love him die, are killed, are taken away from him, and he has to keep going. It's a hero story. And I think for a lot of kids, that's really, really important. My nieces, the eldest is nearly 20, they grew up with Harry Potter, with their mother reading the stories to them when they were very little and reading them themselves as they got older. My goddaughters did the same. There's no doubt that the characters, the kind of ideas about shaping what it means to be brave, to be honest, to be committed to good, to be against evil, to be willing to die for your friends, I think those values are really, really important, especially when you're a teenager, when it's a pretty, often horrible time in your life.
And Harry dies and is resurrected, and perhaps that already begins to ring some bells in people's ears. It looks a bit like another story. Many years ago, I was at a conference about the Arthurian legend, and it was pointed out that King Arthur is a person who has certain commonalities with Jesus Christ too, and that in legend he is not dead, but only sleeping to come back at the time when Britain most needs him. And it struck me as interesting that many cultures had a culture hero. They're all men, I'm afraid, from the Middle Ages generally, who was seen as a kind of protector for the nation in the way that Arthur is in Britain. In fact, there are similar stories about Charlemagne in Germany, that he will come back when needed.
I mean, Snape is a fantastic character, isn't he? I mean, it's really, and he's so important for the whole series. It turns out at the end, actually, which I find also a fantastic device by J.K. Rowling. He's the evil teacher, and he makes Harry Potter's life miserable. And then at the end, he turns out to be double agent. He turns to be someone who makes probably one of the biggest sacrifices in the whole Potter series. Without him, the whole story couldn't have happened, actually. So he's evil and he's crucial. He's Judas, isn't he?
No,
okay.
Not Judas.
It's my pet theory. You just destroyed my pet theory.
Well, I didn't destroy it. But no, how can he be Judas? Judas betrays Jesus. He brings about Jesus' death.
Yes.
And while he is sorry, he repents, but he hangs himself. And he did it for money, for the basest possible motives. Snape...
Yeah, but the story needs him.
But Snape is actually okay. First I have to tell you something. Do you all actually know that for a brief time on the internet, there was a religion devoted to Severus Snape? It had 3 members.
Me.
They were known as the Snape Wives or the Snapists. They were called Rose, Conchetta and Tonya. They were all American, and they all believed themselves to be married and in sexual relationships with him. Mostly sadomasochistic, dominant, submissive relationships. Very interesting. But I got really upset about them because I love Snape. Yeah. How can you not love a man in black? I love Johnny Cash too, actually. But the other thing is that when you get to the end, if you read the novels as an adult and with the sort of insights that a middle-aged person has over a kid, Snape is Lily's true partner, and the great sacrifices are made by him and by her. James, her husband, is Harry's father, but he's a lightweight. Yeah. You don't feel the presence. You don't understand. Snape's whole life is about love, and he has harmed and injured himself and done dreadful things for the greater and higher good. Mm-hmm. He's not.
In a funny kind of quite old-fashioned way, people have a sort of religious experience about this new text. It somehow appears to them that they could just run their life totally according to the principles of that particular text, that you didn't really need anything else. There's another new religion called Dudism, which is based on the film The Big Lebowski, which is, I just think it's one of the best films ever made. It's one of my absolute favourites. If it was just down to me, I wouldn't start a religion based on it. But somebody else did. And his name is Oliver Benjamin. He calls himself the Dudley Lama. He's American, but he lives in Thailand. And there are tens of thousands of people who belong to his church.
Tolkien was devout Catholic, and he thought when he wrote Lord of the Rings that it encompassed Catholic Christian values. But all of the countercultural people read it as a kind of eco-pagan novel. And of course, what all of the Tolkien spiritual people tell you is Tolkien didn't even know he was a channel. The elven world was telling him their story, and so he's just automatic writing this story and the elven realm is all real, and the Valar, the elves, we worship them, and they are real. Tolkien himself, he was just a conduit. He didn't know.
A lot of people nowadays, especially American scholars of religion, talk about religion as if it's like a consumer product. So if we think about it, nowadays we buy clothes, we buy cars, we buy houses, we buy baked beans in tins. We buy everything, really. If you were a peasant in the Middle Ages, you would sleep and work in the same muddy brown woolen shirt and trousers. You wouldn't get any new ones, and you couldn't buy them anyway. So society changes, and the way that you think about yourself changes. Fashion is a really important part of this too, because it evolves. Initially, it's just for rich people. And then when you get to the 19th century and you've got cheap, lovely printed cotton material coming from India, everyone can have new frocks, different shirts, try new styles. You think about yourself differently, the way that you're presented and constructed. What happens is that religions used to present an idea that they were forever and for always the same, eternally stable, that you didn't need anything else, that God didn't change his mind about things. So, for example, society might want to be generous or tolerant towards gay people or, single parents or whatever. But, the values of the church wouldn't change. In the modern era, people have an idea that they should be able to transform themselves, that their self is a kind of project. And one of the things that's done is it's moved a lot of people who want to be religious. They used to be what Wade Clark Roof, who's an American scholar, calls dwellers. You'd be born into a religion and you'd stay there, you'd dwell in it, and it would remain your religion till you died. Nowadays, people are seekers. So you're interested. You may be born a Catholic or a Buddhist or a Lutheran, but during your spiritual quest, when you're building and crafting yourself, when you are a teenager and you have a goth phase, you might study the works of Aleister Crowley and get interested in the occult and want to be a magician. And then when you grow up and you become corporate, you might go and get interested in that kind of Buddhism and self-help for making loads of money and being really successful. When you have children, if you have children, I never did, but a lot of my friends went sort of back to religion. They wanted their children to go to a church school, or they wanted to get married in church. And then by the time you get to the end of your life and you have a funeral, you might have an entirely secular funeral in which people raise glasses of champagne and tell stories about what a great person you were, or you might have a Buddhist funeral, or you might have a church funeral. People move around now. They don't dwell in the one place. That kind of religion, which has replaced little churches with big stadium arenas that when you go to church, it's like going to a rock concert or to a big theatrical event where, for example, when you walk into church, there's a coffee shop in the foyer and you can drink coffee and eat donuts while listening to the pastor preaching. That is an example of adapting to modern life. And I think it goes further than that. When I was young, my family were Catholic and quite conservative. There was an idea that if you were religious, for example, you usually weren't super fashionable because fashion was often about being sexual. And if you were religious, you weren't supposed to be. There's a hilarious paper that a friend of mine, John Connell, who's a human geographer, wrote about Hillsong Church in the Sydney suburbs. He wrote it quite a while ago. And one of the first things he says at the beginning is, I'm not being sleazy here, but when I went to this church, I was greeted by girls in hipster jeans and crop tops. And he said they looked like tarts. This is the whole point. Nowadays, it doesn't matter that this fashion is somehow kind of sexual and out there. Part of being kind of fashionably religious is that you can have Botox and bleach your hair and go to the gym every day and be 55 and try to look 35 and wear crop tops or 5-inch heels or things like that, mini skirts. It doesn't matter. It's not connected to morality anymore. It's a statement about how you present yourself. If we think about the products in a supermarket model again, the people who work on what's called rational choice theory in religion, people like Lawrence Iannacone and Rodney Stark, they think that each religion is kind of like a different can of soup in the supermarket. And, there's always going to be a niche group of people who like that can of soup. Even if the most popular one, the one that most people like, is that one, there'll be other people who want the different one. And so I think it's not likely that we'll have a universal religion because that is kind of like a totalizing thing. It wants to bring people are really interested in the idea that they're unique and special and creative and an individual. And the hilarious thing is, a lot of the time that they're not, they're just doing the same thing as everybody else. But the kind of project of the self-crafting makes people think of themselves as special, unique. And of course, it's partly because our consciousness is the first consciousness that we know and the one that we always know best. It wouldn't matter how well you know another person, you can never know them in the way that you know yourself, the way that you live in your own head, in your own mind. There's an American scholar called Bron Taylor who wrote a book a couple of years ago called Dark Green Religion, where he said that a lot of people who are interested in the environment are kind of light green. They'll do a little bit. They'll recycle their garbage and, buy organic food and things like that. But he said once you get to people who are really dark green, who the environment and ecology is the biggest value in their life, then he says that's religious. Even if it's not a church, it's not an organization. It's like people who would live in trees for years to prevent them being cut down, people who would lie in front of bulldozers to stop dams being built. He said that is a spiritual movement that is genuinely religious. But there is, in fact, a church called the Church of All Worlds, which is a modern pagan religion that was founded in the 1960s by two men, Tim Zell, who's now called Oberon Zell, and his friend Lance Christie, who died in 2010. They founded this Church of All Worlds based on a church in a science fiction novel by Robert A. Heinlein. But one of the most important things about it is it worships the earth as goddess. And so it's completely ecologically oriented as well. So it is kind of pagan, they have other gods and goddesses, and they do pagan-style rituals, and they have those kinds of ideas. They have magical ideas. In fact, they're very interested in Harry Potter. But they've been going for a long time before Harry Potter.
How do you think the religion in the future will look like?
Well, there are two answers. The first is that fundamentalism will take over and all of these interesting new developments will die. I hope this is not true, but I was reading a chapter by a scholar called Alexander van der Haven very recently, last month, and he talked about the fact that in religion nowadays there are people who want certainty and there are people who really enjoy uncertainty. And the people who want certainty, of course, they're fundamentalists. They're looking for the answer. They want to be able to punish everybody who doesn't believe what they believe. And if that trend becomes dominant, then all of these really inventive, really creative kinds of religion will just not amount to anything. But if the people who really embrace uncertainty, what Alexander van der Haven calls hypothetical religion, get the upper hand, then the future of religion is that there'll be more of it in more diverse forms, but it'll probably be smaller groups, and people will be in it for shorter periods, and they'll move on to other kinds of things, and they'll combine these ideas and make new religions, and so we'll have an endless production of new spiritual forms.
So I think that we have an idea about tame religion, and we have an idea perhaps about wild religion. And in our world, most religion is kind of tame, because the West is a control freak world where there's law and statutes and borders and governments, and religions mostly have to operate within that framework. And then we have an idea about wild religion, and wild religion is terrorists and militias and armies running across wild, untamed parts of the planet, which is not where we live.
I actually think that traditional religions are a lot more ambiguous about values than you would normally imagine. Almost everybody says, oh, every religion says don't kill. But if you examine those religions carefully, they actually say don't kill except...
The truth of the matter is every existing religion, all the ancient ones, the respectable ones that everybody agrees are religions, all have terrible values. The thing is that the majority of people don't practice them, but the idea, everyone says, people who talk generally about this, they think, oh, but really good religion would always say you don't kill. Actually, no. It says you don't kill if they're people who are like us and they don't violate our principles and they're not the enemies of our God and they're not in a situation of justifiable, combat, conflict, etc. And most people, even the religions that thought of as nice, Buddhism, there have been armies that marched across parts of Asia, massacring millions of people in the name of Buddhism. We teach a unit, I don't teach it. I would quite like to, I guess, but one of my colleagues is much better at it. And we teach a unit on religion and violence, and it's confronting disgusting stuff. And every year, some students complain. But the whole thing is backed up to the hilt, textual evidence, history, care. Very great care is taken to show every religion doing ugly, violent, appalling things. And it has to exist because that is real. It happens.
There were always rules that you can bend. If you were powerful or rich, there are always people you can kill. So I actually think human values are sort of fundamental. Most people believe, and this sounds very wet and very hopeless, most people believe that if you can get along with people and everyone be nice to each other and nobody bother each other and everybody just do what they want to do without causing anyone any harm, everyone will be happy. That's kind of a really, really, really silly statement. There's actually a couple of scholars in America who work on values at the moment of teenagers in America, and they say most of them are what are called moralistic, therapeutic deists. They believe in some kind of God, not a very close God, kind of up there. God wants you to be happy, have a lovely life. If you're in a bad place, you can call on God. But if you're happy, you mostly don't bother talking to him or her. It's not significant. And in the end, everyone will go to heaven. And that sounds terrible. I mean, when I talk about it to my students, I call it tea bag religion. You know, just add hot water, you've got it. But that's what most people believe nowadays, in the West at least. Obviously, we see trends in the religious world around other parts of the world that we might think of as alarming, because they tend more towards that certainty and fundamentalism thing. But it all depends which kind of values, if you like, on a global scale you think will win. And if kind of the capitalist global economy wins, then we will have more people who think that they can craft their own spirituality and buy more products and work on themselves and invent new things that will make them happy. Almost everything, if you like, is a kind of fiction, because it's not possible to describe as something is happening exactly what is happening to you. When I have an emotion and I tell you about it, in fact, I am representing me to you. When you tell me that you think you understood what I said and it creates a different response in you, you are representing you back to me. Every sort of encounter is a kind of story, if you like, a kind of fiction. I don't like the idea that fiction means that these things have no resemblance to fact or are, for example, frivolously invented. It's more that when we express using language, we make everything into a story. And that idea that things have beginnings and middles and ends is really important. And in fact, we can see that when people break down, when something terrible happens to them, one of the things that they lose is the ability to construct a kind of sensible story. So say somebody discovers a person who has been murdered. One of the reasons why we're so interested in detective fiction and in crime films is because that retains the old structure of creating meaning out of violent, seemingly meaningless actions, and also dispensing justice at the end, because we want things to fit into those kinds of structures.